During the filming of Virgin Spring, writer-director Ingmar Bergman wrote a short piece in English entitled A Page from My Diary, as part of the press pack for the international launch of the film. In it, he tells the story of one rainy spring morning in 1959. All were active in order to keep warm, he writes. The temperature was about freezing point, and now and then snowflakes appeared from the ice-gray mist. The crew was struggling to get the aging camera equipment to work in the harsh weather when suddenly the clouds parted and the sun shone through. But when the rays of the sun penetrated and sparked across the mysterious darkness of this water in the forest, Bergman wrote, and through the transparent spring greenery of the Swedish birch trees, someone called out loudly and pointed to the sky. 2 cranes were flying majestically over the treetops. Everyone stopped working to admire the scene. When the birds had disappeared, Bergman mused for a moment how pleasant it would be to have a Hollywood-like setup at his disposal. To have a camera track that isn't buckled, he wrote, a camera truck that doesn't creak, and it would be quite an event for once to make a motion picture with budget of over $250,000, just for the experience. Yet despite all that, I'm saying a straight no to the proposition of America. In this entry, Bergman simultaneously professes his love for the homeland and his reluctance to make films in the US despite the technical advantages possible with Hollywood's resources. At this point in his career, Bergman was indeed turning down a number of international offers on the grounds of his deep affinity with his homeland. In this essay, however, I would like to complicate Bergman's early reluctance to work in the US. His devotion to national cinema stemmed not only from a love for his country. Ingmar Bergman was obsessively concerned with how his films and himself were perceived early in his career, and he feared that he would lose control over his persona if he were to move abroad before fully establishing himself in Sweden. Drawing from essays on authorship and the celebrity by Michel Foucault and Richard Dyer, I will discuss Bergman's obsessive concern with how viewers perceived his films and himself. Specifically, I will consider how Bergman obsessively and futilely tried to control what his name represented, especially once his work expanded to American theaters. He finishes his 1959 entry writing that he felt secure and at home in Sweden, an ironic comment given Bergman's public disdain for local criticism about his work. In a famous 1960 critique, Swedish filmmaker Bo Widerberg accused Bergman of creative stagnation, writing, "What one expects with growing impatience from this brilliant technician and director of actors is for him to move on, to grow tired of his role as our Dala horse to the world. All we expect of a Dala horse is that it should look like a Dala horse, and satisfying that demand would probably mean death for any artist in the long run." Bergman clearly disliked this pamphlet, and replied with a patronizing public response to Widerberg. Film critic Richard Dyer explains how a star is an image which covers both on-screen and off-screen life and comprises a collection of texts that can be read in various ways. His reply to Widerberg exemplifies his attempt to fashion his off-screen life and thus his existence as a star within Sweden. Ingmar Bergman was by no means an on-screen star, but his early cameos speak to his desire to be viewed by filmgoers as not simply a director behind the camera, but as a personality with a face to his work. In early films such as It Rains on Our Love and Music in Darkness, Bergman appropriates Hitchcock-style cameos to mark himself as a hidden auteur working within the constraints of Swedish commercial genre cinema. Although his on-screen cameos ceased once he became a household name in Sweden, his technique of directly injecting himself into his work continued throughout his career, frequently manifesting as his own voiceover narration, as in Persona in 1966.
Vika för långa promenader, fisketurer, matlagning, brevskrivning och andra förströelser.
Bergman actively tried to influence the meaning of his name in Sweden through a number of methods. One such method was through articles published under a pseudonym, in the above example, Your Devoted Dala Horse, which often served as self-criticism or the rewording of others' criticism. Another example is how he tried to direct himself on television and how he did not want to be in a certain public debate if it was to be broadcasted live. By 1949, the year Prison was released, Bergman was no longer a contract director, but a local celebrity who was referred to in Swedish press by just his last name. Ingmar Bergman's name, as with any author, is not a pure and simple reference, however. Leaning on Michel Foucault's notion of the author function, Bergman's name is the equivalent of a description of his life's work up to that point, and this description of his work is dependent on the culture which utters his name. Bergman was not interested in entering the US market for a number of reasons. The first was a fear that he would lose some creative control, despite the potential financial gains. For a perfectionist, this is not entirely surprising. European directors such as Godard and Truffaut, like Bergman, deliberately turned down attractive foreign offers and international stars in order to produce films that had a local, handmade character. This homemade quality was important to Bergman and these directors, especially as Hollywood's dominance over Western cinema greatly influenced how films were made, and especially how they were received by filmgoers. David Bordwell, in Narration and Fiction Film, explains how Hollywood engineered films to have aspects which audience grew to expect in the mid-century, such as character-centered causality, question-and-answer logic, and problem-solving routines. There were European émigrés who successfully maintained their patrimony while working within the confines of American cinema. In a 2006 interview, Bergman complimented Victor Sjöström's 1924 film, He Who Gets Slapped, saying, "Isn't it incredible how Sjöström could adapt to Hollywood, yet still be so innovative?" Here Bergman clearly acknowledges Hollywood's demands for simplistic film styles. But Bergman also was wary of Americans misreading his films, something that he already felt he needed to deal with in Sweden. Eventually, however, his films could not escape American opportunists. By the mid-1950s, American filmgoers were already accustomed to foreign imports, and the labeling of these as art cinema began to connote a very particular kind of realism, to do with explicit depictions of sex and drugs, rather than political or aesthetic commitment. Before Bergman was fully canonized as the most philosophically and grimly serious of all European auteurs, sexploitation and Swedish sin were a decisive part of his entry into the American film market. In 1955, exploitation film presenter Kroger Babb illegally acquired a print of Summer with Monica and rebranded it as Monica, the Story of a Bad Girl, a shortened and dubbed version of the director's 1953 work. Bergman strongly disliked how American audiences viewed his films. He expressed particular discomfort with the poor dubbing, which reduced his dialogue performed with nuance by Harriet Anderson and Lars Ekborg to American weak sauce, in Bergman's own words.
Well, here we are, far from everybody. Aren't you happy?
Oh, yes, isn't it wonderful? I'm sorry for those poor people in town. All work and no fun.
And for us, Monica, my darling, it's all fun and no work.
Interestingly, Bergman's original has a scene in which Monica and Harry go to a Stockholm cinema to see an American romance film called Song of Love. In Bergman's parody of an insipid escapist Hollywood romance, the bland line readings of the couple on screen could almost double for the vacuous, cliched line readings in Babb's dubbed version.
You may kiss me now, honey.
Farewell, my love. We may never see each other again.
Oh.
Farewell, my love.
Farewell.
Eventually, American rights to Bergman's films fell under the control of Janus Films, which eventually re-released his original works in the US. However, Bergman's 50s persona was still so identified with artsy erotica and exploitation that Janus initially capitalized on it. For example, their 1963 trailer, created for the American version of The Silence, aggressively sold the sexploitative elements of the film.
Ingmar Bergman, one of the world's most acclaimed directors of motion pictures, brings to audiences this his most stunning film, The Silence. This compelling drama is an intimate, fascinating look into a world where people seek to communicate through the ruthless gratification of their sexual appetites.
Of course, Hollywood is not entirely to blame for the sexual aspects of his films. Bergman enjoyed displaying heterosexual romance without censorship. He did not, however, desire his films to be seen principally as raunchy attractions. In Sweden, Bergman was able to delicately frame himself as an expert concerning women. In fact, he was often used as a point of reference to illustrate how well someone else was a woman expert. Alternatively, his name in Hollywood needed to be simplified to that of a womanizer to capture the attention of American art house filmgoers. For many years, Bergman's name was still associated with that of other sexploitation filmmakers in the US. Bergman's function as author to reinforce himself through his own discourse, such as with his public appearances on television and in written criticism, did not penetrate American media like it did in Sweden. In Sweden, Bergman's publicized affairs encouraged viewers to see the relationships in his films as displays of complex interactions grounded in realism. In one of his published essays from 1972, he writes, "Obsessed with a sexuality that forced me into constant infidelity, I was tormented by desire, fear, anguish, and a guilty conscience. Bergman's public explanations of his inability to love had the effect in Sweden of complicating the sexual aspects of his films, which were lost on American viewers. Today, we find a paradoxical phenomenon associated with Bergman's earlier attempts to influence his public persona. Where Bergman is internationally perceived as a highbrow artist, he is nationally considered a dominant and egocentric artist with too much power. In present discourse, American critics and classrooms praise Bergman's artistry, yet in Sweden, negative undertones persist. Ingmar Bergman's attempt to use his public image to influence how others view his work seems to backfire. Bergman himself conceded in his 2007 interview that he was not a likable filmmaker and that his attempts to rectify his bad press only worsened his public persona in Sweden. In the 1950s, Ingmar Bergman worked obsessively to establish himself in Sweden as the great filmmaker we know today in the United States. However, as he was so focused on his self-fashioning in his home country, Bergman ignored the Hollywood machine, as he feared he would lose control over his persona. This fear was largely well-founded, however. Bergman's 1950s films, such as Summer with Monica, Summer Interlude, and Smiles of a Summer Night, were cannibalized by the industry. But his inability to control his persona in the States eventually served him well. Bergman's name in America does not associate to the neurotic and aggressive celebrity of Sweden, but a master auteur.